The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read. Your source for news, politics, sports, and all things trending. Here's your host, Marcus Gentry.
My own history classes were only a part of the rebellion against the only kind of textbooks available. It was a general rebellion against the subtle message, even from the most liberal white authors and their Negro disciples. You belong to a race of nobodies. You have no worthwhile history to point to with pride. The destruction of black civilization, therefore, could not wait another 5 years just to be more detailed, impressive, or massive in scope. For a reinterpretation of the history of the African race could be compressed into a smaller work for background reading, and so written that black John Doe, cab driver or laborer, and Jane Doe, housemaid or waitress, can read and understand the message from their forefathers and foremothers, as well as college students and professors.
In regards to ancient civilizations, technologies of ancient civilizations, spirituality in that space as well.
Sure.
So I'll just start with a very easy question. Who built the pyramids?
Well, so I'm going to start. I'll start with an easy answer to lay a foundation.
Sure.
To the answer to that question, if I can. You know, when I was in school back in the Midwest of this big beautiful country we live in, 1950s, 1960s, I was taught at that time what we are still teaching our children today, and that is that civilization began in an isolated location in what today we call the Tigris-Euphrates Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And it began in a primitive state and evolved in a linear fashion, slowly, gradually over a long period of time to what we have today. The problem with that story, Alex, is the evidence doesn't support it. And there is still there's a battle to maintain what is called the standard model when it comes to our history, when it comes to civilization, when it comes to science, when it comes to physics, when it comes to human origins. There's a battle to maintain this static story. Excuse me, it was developed, in late 1800s, early 1900s.
Welcome to the Daily Read, and I am your host, Marcus Gentry. Today, we're going to talk about civilization, black civilization, and whether our history and our civilization is linear or cyclic. I ran across this a while back, but I didn't run across Greg Braden. Greg Braden is an archaeologist, and he studies the past, buildings, pyramids, temples, and things of that nature. And there have been some amazing things found that predates even the pyramids. And we as black people, we always search for an identity here in America. Of course, the blacks in Africa that are born in Uganda and Somalia and places like that, it's a little easier to find their identity or who their past is. Of course, things get passed down, and then they have records, their own type of records. But for us here in the Americas, it's a little different. And the reason why this is fascinating, I'm going to use both of these men who were born years apart, and their research is different. Like I said, Greg Braden is an archaeologist, and Chancellor Washington, he was a scholar, and he went on a quest to find the lost black civilization that we've lost over the decades and hundreds of years. This is going to be a controversial show for some people, because as things go further into this show, there are going to be some things that come up that's going to contradict religious and historical things that have been taught. You see, people always say, how come the dinosaurs are not in the Bible? People always say, how come the pyramids aren't mentioned in the Bible? Well, I have an idea about that. But like I said, this is my opinion. Some of you can look up this research, and I'll leave both of these men's names in the bottom of the description. But before we get further into the show, I'm going to read some news that I've been following here. Jury finds Ed Sheeran didn't copy Marvin Gaye's classic, Let's Get It On. I guess the jury must have listened to both of those songs and found that the English singer Ed Sheeran, his song Thinking Out Loud was not a direct copy. So good for him. He probably would have been lost out of a lot of money if they would have found him guilty. First black St. Louis prosecutor Kim Gardner resigns. This story fascinated me because St. Louis, especially East St., has been known to be a black area where a lot of us minorities are congregated, and to have the first black prosecutor there that's amazing. But they're saying that when she came into office, she was not prosecuting crimes. She was letting a lot of people go unprosecuted. So now she decided to step down. COVID-19 has dropped to the 4th leading death in U.S. history, right, as far as the census go right now. COVID-19 is the 4th leading death in the U.S. Death period by COVID-19 is bad, but you know, by it dropping to number 4, that means it's calming down. It's still out here, people. You know, it's still out here. There's a writer strike going on in Hollywood. This story interests me because the last writing strike we had, well, actually it wasn't really a writing strike. We had a writing strike before COVID-19, but when COVID-19 hit, of course, a lot of writers were out of work because of Hollywood being shut down. And that affected a lot of movies, a lot of entertainment. And I'm a big science fiction fan. So that's one to keep an eye on. It might be months before we get any new material as far as movies go. U.S. approves vaccine for RSV after decades of attempts. This one right here fascinated me because Arexvy is the name of the drug, and they already give kids RSV shots because, you know, they're still developing. But now this drug has finally been approved for elderly people. And you know, the older you get, it's almost like you're going in reverse. So they just approved that, another RSV shot for elderly people to help protect their lungs from having breathing problems and things of that nature. And those are some of the stories that I think some of you guys should take a look at. Let's get back to this story. Okay, like I said, the destruction of black civilization, I ran across this a long time ago, and I picked it back up because he said a lot of things about black civilization and the things that he found out on his trips and his journey through Africa. And it was very fascinating. And you can compare the science of Greg with Chancellor, you know, with his things that he went to Africa and saw and studied. You can almost compare the two. Like, there's going to be a story in here where Chancellor Williams found out that the Barbers were basically a white race of people had settled on the western coast of Africa. and it was almost like a forced migration. But when you compare the notes to what Greg Braden said, how civilizations were destroyed through catastrophic happenings like a flood or meteorites, it forced people to invade other people's lands. I mean, this is some deep stuff. Let's get further into this.
And what I find fascinating, Greg, is that the pyramids, which were supposed to be the oldest of all of them, it seems to two things. One, it was said it was a king's chamber, yet there's nothing that's ever proven that at all. They've never found a corpse. There's no hieroglyphs. It completely goes against every other tomb we've ever found. And two, it seems that the technology keeps getting worse. So the pyramids, as they get closer to our time period, seem to degrade almost in the style that they're being built. They should be getting better, and there should be more of them out there, right?
Well, it is true, Alex, and it's something. This is not isolated. Well, first, I'm just going to back up.
Is a form of radiometric dating, and all it is measuring the decay of a certain type of atom found in a once living organism to determine when it was last alive. But they're formed at a reliable, steady rate. So at any point in time, we have a pretty good idea of the ratio of carbon-12 atoms to carbon-14 atoms. Got that? It's important. Now, carbon dioxide is essential to life here on Earth. Plants breathe it in, animals eat the plants, we eat the animals and the plants, and these carbon molecules, carbon-14 and 12, that make up the carbon dioxide, get in everything. What's neat is that the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 found in all these living things here on Earth is pretty much the same as what's in the atmosphere, which means it's predictable. And some very, very smart scientists have figured out that carbon-14 actually decays at a predictable rate, right? Carbon-14, like all radioactive particles, has what's called a half-life. Now, the half-life is the amount of time it takes for the number of radioactive particles in a sample to decrease by half. Carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years. That means that after 5,730 years, the amount of carbon-14 atoms in a, say, plant that you found fossilized will be half of what it was the last time that plant took, well, a breath of life. After 11,460 years, which is 2 half-lives, there'll be a quarter the amount of carbon-14 that was originally present. And then after 17,190 years, you'll have just an eighth of the number of carbon-14, and so on until there's none left.
I'm gonna stop that right there. The reason I played that carbon dating is because this is how scientists figure out the age of certain things. Okay, we're gonna get technical. I'm gonna stop the dumb stuff. I've been dealing with dumb stuff for the last 4-5 months. We on some serious stuff, some serious topics now. Carbon dating is how scientists figure out the lifespan of something that was alive and when it died. And this guy was just explaining how it works. But Greg Braden is going to tell you that you cannot carbon date a building. Listen carefully. How scientists judge how old a building is, they find mice, animals, things of that nature that died inside that building. And then they carbon date the animal. Usually it's a mummy. Like say there's a temple that has a mummy in it. They'll go and carbon date the mummy because that mummy was a human being. It was alive. So they carbon date the mummy. And if the mummy died 3,000 years ago, the scientists say, okay, this building has to be around 3,000 years old. What Greg is going to show you is the Sphinx and the pyramids. You can't date them like that. And the reason why is because animals like mice, rodents, that was alive can crawl inside of those buildings and die. A lot of those carbon date, there was no mummy, there was no king found inside the pyramids. None. There were other pyramids built for kings and pharaohs, but the three main pyramids, there were no mummies found inside of those three main pyramids. They were just empty chambers. He's predicting that these pyramids are ancient, old, far beyond what we think that the age of them are. Now let's dive further into this.
The way that they have dated the pyramids, you cannot date something that has not been alive. You can only carbon date something that has been living, breathing oxygen, carbon-based life. So stone cannot be carbon dated. The way that they have dated these pyramids is by estimating through, who was the king at what period of time, and, whose face is on a statue or something like that. And then here, this makes no sense at all. They also have found mice and rats inside the pyramid that are dead and mummified, and they carbon date those dead mice and rats. They might date to 4,000 or 5,000 years before present. There is nothing linking that dead rat to the origin of the pyramid. The rat could have come in 1,000 years ago, inside of the pyramid. But this is where the scientific community, they've got a story and they want to stick with it. And this is what I said at the beginning, there's a battle for what is called the standard model. And they had this all nice and buttoned up, nice and tidy, about the kings and the eras. So where all this is leading, if the Sphinx was already existing when the ice melted, and if the Great Pyramid was made using technology and incorporating mathematics that are so sophisticated, we didn't know it until recently. Where did that come from? All of this is pointing to, and it's something I've talked about extensively, is that civilization appears to be cyclic rather than linear.
Let's go back to what I said earlier. As of today, the history books tell that our history goes back almost 5,000 years. That's what you call linear. There was a start date that we could look at in our history books and our ancient texts like the Bible, the Quran, and things like that. That stuff goes back almost 5,000 years. Okay. What he's saying is there are cycles of civilizations, and each cycle ends with a devastating blow to the world, like a meteorite, a flood that wipes out technology, it wipes out people, and the people who are left alive move to other regions and invade other regions. And then the cycle starts all over new. Chancellor Williams, on his journey to Africa, this is fascinating, he found out the same thing, but he found it out through a scholarly lens. Okay, not a geographical. He didn't find the things out that Greg Braden found out. Greg Braden found the things out through, his studies on technologies and going out into the field and digging up some of these buildings. Chancellor Williams found this out by going around Africa looking up the text, because he was on a journey to find out where black civilization disappeared and how come it was destroyed. Let's get back to Chancellor Williams.
Origin and development of study. In a small town surrounded by cotton fields in South Carolina, a little black boy in the 5th grade began to to harass teachers, preachers, parents, and grandparents with questions which none seemed able to answer. How is it that white folks have everything and we have nothing? Slavery? How and why did we become their slaves in the first place? White children go to fine brick, stone, and marble schools 9 months a year, while we go to a ramshackle old barn-like building only 5.5 months, and then to the cotton fields. Why? In the 6th grade, one of our teachers, Miss Alice Crossland, helped me to become a sales agent for the Crisis and the Norfolk Journal and Guide. This was like turning on the floodlights of heaven, for the books on our race, listed on the back pages of the Crisis, started me off on this never-ending search, but raised more questions as I progressed through school. Raised more perplexing questions than were answered. For, having read everything about the African race that I could get my hands on, I knew even before leaving high school that, 1, the land of the blacks was not only the cradle of civilization itself, but that the blacks were once the leading people on earth. 2, that Egypt was not only once all black, but the very name Egypt was derived from the blacks. 3, and that the blacks were the pioneers in the sciences, medicine, architecture, writing, and were the first builders in stone, etc.
Now, again, Chancellor Williams is finding this out from a linear perspective. Our cradle of life started in Africa, but there were cycles, and we lived in those other cycles. But when those other cycles got destroyed, a lot of those peoples from those other areas invaded our area. And this goes back to the Bible. In the Bible, it has text talking about how the men, the giants, the Nephilim came down and made away with women and had children. How when Adam and Eve left the garden, there were already other people after they left the garden. This is not hard to understand. Chancellor Williams is finding out our history and what was robbed from us. But what Greg Braden is saying is there were other civilizations that was alive at the same time. Get what I'm saying, people? Our cradle of beginning is in Africa, but there were other cradles of civilizations in other places that got destroyed by catastrophes. So those other cradles of civilizations had to go somewhere else. That's how you got the mixing of blood. That's how you got the enslavement of the black race of people. This is some fascinating stuff.
The big unanswered question then was, what had happened? How was this highly advanced black civilization so completely destroyed that its people in our times and for some centuries past have found themselves not only behind the other peoples of the world, but even the color of their skin a sign of inferiority, bad luck, and the badge of the slave, whether bond or freed? And since I had learned that whites were once enslaved as generally as any other race, how did it come about that slavery was finally concentrated in Africa for blacks only? In short, No books or other studies in high school and college answered or gave clues to answers to the problems that puzzled me most. For no matter what the factual data were, all the books written about the blacks by their conquerors reflected the conquerors' viewpoints. My inquiry, therefore, was concerned with black civilization alone. What the blacks themselves achieved independently of either Europe or Asia. This was an entirely new approach to the study of the history of the blacks. It meant, first of all, segregating traditional African institutions from those later influenced by Islamic Asia and Christian Europe. In this way, and in no other, we can determine what our heritage really is, and instead of just talking about identity, we shall know at least precisely what purely African body of principles, value systems, or philosophy of life, slowly evolved by our own forefathers over countless ages, from which we can develop an African ideology to guide us onward. In other words, there can be no real identity with our heritage until we know what our heritage really is. It is all hidden in our history, but we are ignorant of that history. So we have been floating along, basking blissfully in the sunny heritage of other peoples.
Now, I always say there's patterns. I always talk about seeing the patterns, because I do. And when you look at the pattern of how Asian people, even though they're human, have a different body structure and makeup from us, how the Native Americans and the white Europeans have a different body structure and makeup from us. There's a reason behind this. And like I said, Greg Braden, he talked about it as being there were at least 5 civilizations that considered themselves the cradle of life. Most of those other civilizations were destroyed. He talks about possibly Atlantis, the Incans. You know, there's a lot of the Asians had temples that looked like pyramids. Because, have you ever, okay, put it this way, I travel a lot, and I can go to Illinois and see the structures of how the buildings look compared to how the structures of the buildings look in Tennessee. And you know, when I start noticing the different building structures is when I cross into Cairo. Cairo is like right there at the border between Tennessee, Missouri, and Illinois. When you cross over into Cairo, you can literally drive down that road after you cross over that bridge, and you can see the different building designs. It's almost like a different race of people live in this area than Tennessee. And there's a reason for that. Just like Chancellor Williams is finding out, just like Greg Braden found out, there was a similar building structure in the shape of pyramids, because that was the building structure of temples during those eras. It was basically conformity. But when those other civilizations got destroyed through calamity or catastrophe, those people had to go somewhere. They had to get out of their area. The only other place to go is to invade other people's countries. And this is how you get enslavement. Let's continue on.
My research was a quest for some specific answers to very specific questions. Some of these were: 1. How did all black Egypt become all white Egypt? Note, at this point, that mulattoes were classified as white in Egypt. All North Africa and the Middle East, a fact that still confuses blacks in the United States, where the very opposite policy was adopted. 2. What were some of the specific details in the process of so completely blotting out the achievements of the African race from the annals of history? Just how could this be done on such a universal scale? 3. How and under what circumstances did Africans, among the very first people to invent writing, lose this art almost completely? 4. Is there a single African race? One African people? 5. If one race or one people, how do you explain the numerous languages, cultural varieties, and tribal groupings? 6. Since, as it seemed to me, there are far more disunity, self-hatred, and mutual antagonisms among blacks than any other people, is there a historical explanation for this? 7. And how, in puzzling contrast, is the undying love of blacks for their European and Asian conquerors and enslavers explained? These questions, along with those stated earlier, constituted the core problems for 16 years of study.
16 years of study, people. That's a journey. Chancellor Williams found out through scholarly work that our history was basically destroyed because of other people and other civilizations encroaching on our territory. That's why when you see Egyptian earrings and hoops and things of that nature, when you see movies of Egyptians, they put white people in them roles. Those were black people. But over time, like he said, they mixed in with the invaders. These people weren't invaders just to be invading. They were invaders because they was running from something. They brought their own religious beliefs with them. They brought their own ways and habits with them. And as Chancellor Williams is going to tell you, we had our own form of government, our own technologies. And the invaders brought their own technologies, such as gunpowder. Everybody who is a little bit knowledgeable about history knows that gunpowder was invented in China. We perfected it with the atom bomb and bullets and things of that nature. But gunpowder was actually invented in China. We didn't mess with gunpowder. So a lot of these invaders brought their technologies with them. Let's continue on.
History of the race could not be understood if studied in isolation. I began a slow and deliberately unrushed review of European history, ancient and modern, and the history of the Arabs and Islam. I say review because by 1950 I had already studied and taught in the three fields of American, European, and Arabic history, a most fortunate circumstance for the task ahead. 2. Began the formal study of Africa and Europe, not Africa. I did not know how very wise this was when the decision was made, for I did not then know that Europe and Asia had been hauling out of Africa over the centuries just about all of the historical materials I needed to see and study at the very outset, and which of course could not be found in Africa.
Now, this is a good thing, and hopefully we can have more Chancellor Williams going out here finding this stuff out. I haven't heard of any black scholars trying to dig up our ancestry. You know, of course, we have individuals who try to find their ancestry. I personally looked up my grandmother's side of the family, and we come from Lumbee Indians. Lumbee Indians are called the people of color, and we are a branch off from the Cherokee Nation. And an old man named CD. See, my grandmother was a Harris before she married my grandfather and became a gentry. So when I looked up our side of the family on her side, it's hard to find the family tree on my side, because the Gentrys, the Williams, the Jones, those were common slave names that was given out to slaves as far as when they set them free. But on the Harris side, my grandmother was a Locklear and she was a Locklear and a not an Oxendine, but what is the other one? There was two families that my grandmother came from on that side of the family. And the chief woman man killer, she was the chief over the Eastern Cherokee Nation. She stopped the black Indians in the North Carolina area from having recognition, because she felt that money from the government would be taken from the Cherokee Nation. Because like I said, we black people with Native American blood. So the Lumbee Indians are recognized as black Indians, but we don't get federal land, federal funds, because like I said, she went to Congress and had that stopped. So there are individuals out here that are searching their individual histories, but Chancellor Williams went further. We're going to go deeper into this when we get back.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read.
Social and economic systems through the millenniums reveal the same overall pattern of unity and sameness of all fundamental institutions. That there is a historical and fundamental basis for real brotherhood and unity of the black race could not have escaped the notice of all of those Europeans who have been investigating and writing about Africa over the years. But they are shrewd. Massive black unity would be massive black power, which of course would reduce white power and its domination of the whole earth. So white Africanist writers always concentrate on the ethnic differences among Africans, tribal antagonisms, hopeless language barriers.
Now remember what I said earlier. What Chancellor Williams was finding out is from a linear historical outlook. And what Greg Braden was finding out is we're not living in a linear situation. You know, the earth is cyclic, which means we're right now living in the fourth or fifth cycle. So the history that Chancellor Williams is finding out is from a fourth or fifth cycle. But there were civilizations before this cycle that were destroyed. And I'm sure we had civilizations during those cycles too as black people. I'm curious to find out what those histories were. Because like I said, Chancellor Williams is finding out only the surface by talking about basically after the flood. I'm going to go there. I didn't want to go there all the way. I touched on the Bible a little bit, but not just the Bible talks about the flood. You know, you have historians and you have scientists who have found evidence of a real flood that basically encompassed most of the earth. And like I said, a lot of these people's civilizations got destroyed, which ended another cycle. There was a story back in a few years back. I don't know if you guys remember this, but the Incan calendar. This is fascinating. Everybody said the world was coming to an end because they got this Incan calendar that they found down in South America that was supposed to end. And like I say, I see patterns. And that Incan calendar, when it ended, nothing happened. Well, the reason why nothing happened is because that was an end of an era. That was an end of a cycle, a 5,000 year cycle. We are now in a fourth or fifth cycle. This is some fascinating stuff. Let's continue on.
The cultural varieties, etc. They even make a separate ethnic group of their own mulatto offsprings from black women by classifying them as white in some areas and coloreds in others. Hence, a system of thought and practices were developed and superimposed on an already divided race to keep them permanently divided. No one can deny that in this too, the whites have been most successful. My autonomous kingdoms. The study began here, firstly because this was the heartland of the African race, where evidence of that first black civilization is to be found there still, despite all the centuries of efforts to destroy it. From the researcher's viewpoint, the most important part of the investigation was the beginning of the task of singling out and clearly setting forth the precise nature of Africa's own independently developed civilization. A continent-wide study of the traditional customary laws of the blacks, for example, enabled us to learn for the first time that a single constitutional system prevailed throughout all black Africa, just as though the whole race, regardless of the countless differences in language and other locally determined cultural patterns, lived under a single government. A similar continent-wide study of African,
even though the evidence no longer supports it. So the new discoveries are now telling us that rather than a single cradle of civilization, excuse me, in the Tigris Euphrates, rather than a single cradle, that there now appear to have been at least 5 simultaneous cradles of civilization. And some of those are very familiar to us. There was one in China. There was one in the Tigris Euphrates. That was Mesopotamia. There is the Indus Valley. Mysterious technologies have been found buried in the Indus Valley and what now is India and Pakistan. There was Corral in northern Peru. There was Mesoamerica. There was the area in what we now call the UK and Europe and that part of the world. So these 5, or depending on how you look at them, maybe 6 simultaneous civilizations. Oh, and Egypt. Egypt was certainly a part of that, and this is a long answer to your question. They appear to have been simultaneous. There appears to be a communication. There's a continuity of knowledge between these civilizations in terms of agriculture, the ability to grow large amounts of food in hostile environments to feed large populations, certainly mathematics, certainly architecture, multi-story buildings. It's no easy feat to build these multi-story structures the way they were built. and a knowledge of the cosmos that we.
Now remember, Greg Braden is talking about civilizations from a cyclic view. From our viewpoint as Christians and Muslims, everything started about 5,000 years ago when it comes down to holy text. You got the flood, you got things of that nature. But what Greg Braden is saying is that a lot of those civilizations got wiped out. And whenever he went on a geological study and he found evidence, him and some of the other geologists, when they found evidence that there were tools, there were pottery, there were things that were older than the area they were studying, they called that an anomaly, and they set that to the side because they have a narrative that this is how it is, and that narrative was built mostly by the conquerors. Where did the conquerors come from? They came from their own civilizations. Their own civilizations got wiped out. That's where the conquerors came from. This is some fascinating stuff. Let's continue on.
Teachers. From just the foregoing aims of the study, it must be obvious that I was still examining various aspects of the probable reasons why the whites became the masters of the globe. In both France and England, I found that the system of education fostered a new kind of aristocracy, an aristocracy of the educated. College graduates constituted the new upper classes. The son of a carpenter or a railroad conductor became estranged from his family and former friends upon receiving his university degree. A case in point was J.L., a young Englishman in my college at Oxford, Lincoln, and who was one of my close friends there. He refused to go home during any of the long vacation breaks because, to quote him, I can no longer associate with my family and old friends. Wouldn't know how to talk with them. We have nothing in common now, you know. The history of colonialism in Africa. The presence of 2 or 3 blacks in the class, while obviously uncomfortable to some, was generally ignored, for African studies were of long standing as an integral part of the imperial system. They were not planned for Africans at all, but for the future administrators of the empire in Africa. So Professor Madden was pointing out in his lecture how difficult and even impossible it was to rule Africans in view of their wild and most primitive system of democracy. For just as fast as African kings or chiefs undertook to carry out British laws which displeased the people would remove them from office. Therefore, this to the study of one of the most significant developments in the entire history of the black race, an ancient system of democracy existing before Greece, evolved from a continent-wide constitution that governed the whole African people as a single race.